The amusement park had been abandoned for years, its once vibrant colors now faded and chipped. Weeds sprouted through cracks in the pavement, and rust crept over the steel skeletons of forgotten rides. The Ferris wheel groaned as it swayed gently in the wind, its cars dangling like pendulums in the oppressive silence. At the heart of the park, hidden beneath a thick layer of dust and debris, sat the clown car. It was a small, dilapidated vehicle, barely large enough to hold the dozen performers who once crammed inside. The paint, once bright with cheerful reds and yellows, had dulled to a sickly orange, and the smiling faces of the clowns painted on its sides now appeared twisted and grotesque. Nobody remembered the last time the park had been open, nor did they recall the names of the clowns who had entertained the crowds. All that remained were whispers of a tragic accident, a collision that had claimed the lives of all who had been inside the car. After the accident, the park had quickly closed, leaving the clown car and the memories of that night to rot. But now, a new group of performers had arrived, lured by the promise of fame and fortune. The park's new owner, a man named Victor, had inherited the land from a distant relative and saw potential in its faded attractions. He gathered a troupe of clowns, each more eager than the last to revive the spirit of the park. Among them was Emma, a young woman with a natural talent for contorting her body into impossible shapes, and Jack, a skilled juggler with a flair for the dramatic. They laughed as they approached the clown car, unaware of the dark history that clung to it like a shadow. Victor, grinning from ear to ear, clapped his hands together. "This is where it all begins, folks. This car is the centerpiece of our show. Let's see how many of you can fit inside." One by one, the performers climbed into the car, their laughter echoing through the empty park. Emma squeezed herself into the front seat, her limbs bending unnaturally to make room for the others. Jack slid in next to her, juggling rubber balls as he did so. The rest of the troupe followed, giggling and chatting as they crammed into the tiny space. As the last performer squeezed in, the door slammed shut with a loud clang, and the engine roared to life on its own. The car jerked forward, sending the clowns tumbling into one another as it sped along the cracked and broken path. The laughter inside quickly turned to shouts of alarm as the car picked up speed, careening around corners and narrowly avoiding obstacles. Emma clutched the seat in front of her, her heart pounding in her chest. "Victor! Stop the car!" But Victor wasn't driving. He stood outside, staring in shock as the car raced away without him. The expressions on the painted clown faces seemed to mock him, their eyes glinting with malice. The car screeched to a halt in the middle of the park, throwing the performers against the sides. For a moment there was only silence, save for the ragged breathing of those inside. Then, faintly, the sound of laughter echoed through the car. Not the joyful laughter of the living, but something else entirely. It was cold, hollow, and filled with malice. The performers froze, their eyes wide with fear, as the temperature in the car plummeted. "What? What is that?" Jack whispered, his voice trembling. Emma's breath came in short, sharp gasps as she felt something cold brush against her skin. "We need to get out of here." But when she reached for the door, it wouldn't budge. The handles were ice cold and the windows had frosted over. The laughter grew louder, and shadows seemed to dance in the corners of the car, twisting and contorting into impossible shapes. They weren't alone. The air inside the clown car grew colder with each passing second, their breath fogging in front of them. The performers huddled together, their earlier bravado gone, replaced by a gnawing sense of dread. Emma pressed her ear to the door, listening for any sign of Victor outside. But all she could hear was the eerie laughter echoing through the car. "I'm telling you, it's stuck!" Jack's voice was tinged with panic as he yanked on the door handle. "We're trapped!" Emma's eyes scanned the car's interior, searching for anything that might explain the sudden drop in temperature or the strange sounds. The seats were worn and tattered, the fabric split in several places, and the floor was littered with debris. But there was something else, a faint smell like burnt rubber, and something far more sinister. "Do you smell that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. One of the other clowns, a tall man with a painted smile that now seemed disturbingly out of place, nodded. "It's like something's burning." Emma's heart skipped a beat. The story of the tragic accident that had closed the park flashed through her mind. She had heard the rumors, but had dismissed them as just that, rumors. Now, though, she wasn't so sure. As they sat in the freezing car, the shadows seemed to grow darker, stretching across the walls and ceiling like ink spreading through water. The once cheerful faces of the painted clowns on the car's exterior now appeared malevolent, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Suddenly, the car jolted, sending the clowns tumbling into each other. The laughter outside grew louder, filling the air with a sense of impending doom. The car was moving again, but not forward. Downward. The floor seemed to drop out from beneath them, as if the car was sinking into the ground. "What's happening?" Emma cried out, clutching Jack's arm. But Jack had no answers. He stared at the floor, where the metal had begun to warp and twist, as if something was pressing up from underneath. The scent of burning grew stronger, acrid and choking. Without warning, the car's interior lights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the performers' faces. And then, as if responding to some unseen command, the shadows began to move. They weren't just shadows. They were figures. Dark, twisted figures that slid across the walls, their limbs bending at unnatural angles. The laughter grew even louder, more manic, as the shadows converged in the center of the car, forming a single towering shape. The performers could only watch in horror as the shadowy figure took form. It was a clown, but not like any they had ever seen. Its face was a grotesque mask of blackened flesh, its eyes hollow and empty. It towered over them, its mouth twisted into a smile that sent shivers down their spines. One of the performers, a young woman with bright red hair, screamed and tried to push her way past the others to the door. But as she reached for the handle, the shadowy clown stretched out a hand, and the temperature in the car plummeted even further. Frost spread across the windows, and the young woman's breath caught in her throat. "Let me out! Let me out!" she shrieked, pounding on the door with frantic fists. But the door remained firmly shut, and the shadowy figure loomed closer. The lights flickered again, and in that brief moment of darkness, the young woman's scream was abruptly cut off. When the lights returned, she was gone. All that remained was a thin layer of frost on the seat where she had been sitting. The other performers stared in horror at the empty space, their minds struggling to comprehend what had just happened. Emma felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead. The shadowy clown figure had dissipated, but the feeling of dread lingered. "They're here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The clowns who died. They're still here." Jack turned to her, his face pale. "What do you mean?" Emma swallowed hard, her eyes fixed on the frost-covered seat. "The spirits, the ones who died in the accident, they're trapped here in this car." The others exchanged nervous glances, their faces masks of fear. The car shuddered again, as if something beneath it was trying to break through. The shadows on the walls twisted and writhed, and the laughter outside grew louder, filling the car with its sinister echo. They were not alone, and they were not safe. The clown car lurched to a stop, but the performers remained frozen in their seats, paralyzed by fear. The laughter outside had faded into an ominous silence, and the only sound now was their own ragged breathing. Emma wiped the frost from the window with trembling fingers, trying to peer outside. But the thick fog that had settled around the car made it impossible to see anything beyond the glass. The shadows within the car had faded, but the oppressive atmosphere lingered, heavy with the weight of unseen eyes. Jack, his hands still trembling, finally managed to force the door open. The cold air outside rushed in, carrying with it the stench of decay. He hesitated, glancing back at the others. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She was the first to step out, her shoes crunching on the frost-covered ground. The others followed, their eyes darting nervously around the desolate park. The fog was so thick, it was like walking through a dream, or a nightmare. As they moved away from the clown car, a low rumble echoed through the park. The ground beneath them vibrated, and the fog seemed to pulse in response, swirling around them in thick, suffocating clouds. Suddenly, a distant voice called out from the fog. It was faint, barely more than a whisper, but it was enough to send chills down Emma's spine. She turned to Jack, her eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" Jack nodded, his face pale. It sounded like someone calling for help. The performers huddled together, their earlier bravado completely gone. Every step they took seemed to bring them deeper into the fog, and the more they walked, the more disoriented they became. The park, which had once been familiar, now felt like a maze designed to keep them trapped. The voice called out again, louder this time. "Help me!" Emma strained to see through the fog, but it was useless. The voice seemed to come from all directions at once, echoing through the dense mist. "We need to find whoever that is," she said, her voice shaking. But as they moved towards the sound, the fog thickened, obscuring their view. The voice grew louder, more desperate, but there was something wrong with it, something inhuman. It was as if the voice was being stretched, distorted by the fog. Then, without warning, the ground beneath their feet gave way. Emma cried out as she fell, the world spinning around her. She landed hard on something cold and metallic, the impact knocking the wind out of her. She gasped for air, her vision swimming as she tried to make sense of what had happened. They had fallen into a deep pit, the walls smooth and lined with metal. The others were scattered around her, groaning in pain. Emma struggled to her feet, her head pounding. The fog had dissipated, leaving them in a dark, enclosed space. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she realized where they were. The pit was the base of the Ferris wheel, the very ride that had once been the pride of the amusement park. But now, it was a rusted hulk, its carriages dangling precariously overhead. The voice called out again, but this time it was clear and distinct, coming from right behind her. Emma spun around, her heart in her throat. The figure that stood before her was a clown, but not one of their troupe. This clown was different, its makeup smeared, its costume torn and burnt. Its eyes were wide, filled with an unnatural light, and its mouth stretched into a grin that was more terrifying than any expression of joy. The clown reached out a hand, its fingers long and twisted. "Help me," it whispered, though its mouth did not move. Emma screamed, stumbling back. The others turned, their faces mirroring her horror as they saw the clown. But before anyone could react, the figure vanished, leaving only a lingering sense of dread. "This place is cursed," one of the performers muttered, his voice shaking. "We need to get out of here." But there was no way out. The walls of the pit were too high and too smooth to climb, and the entrance they had fallen through had sealed shut. They were trapped. As the reality of their situation set in, the performers huddled together, their fear growing with each passing moment. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant creaking of the Ferris wheel above. Then, from the shadows at the edge of the pit, more figures began to emerge. Clowns, dozens of them, each more twisted and grotesque than the last. Their faces were contorted in expressions of agony and malice, their bodies broken and burnt. They moved slowly, their hollow eyes fixed on the terrified performers. Emma's breath caught in her throat as the clowns surrounded them, their whispers filling the air. "Help us! Join us!" The clowns closed in, their twisted smiles growing wider, their hands reaching out with icy fingers. There was no escape, no way to fight back. And then, as the first of the ghostly clowns reached Emma, the lights of the park flickered back to life, casting an eerie glow over the pit. But the lights did nothing to dispel the darkness that had settled over their hearts, for they knew deep down that they were no longer alone. The spirits of the clowns who had died in the tragic accident had returned, and they were hungry for revenge. As the ghostly clowns closed in, Emma's mind raced, trying to make sense of the nightmare that had become their reality. The park's tragic history, once dismissed as mere rumor, now seemed to press down on her like a physical weight. The spirits of the dead clowns were real, and they were angry. "Stay together!" Jack shouted, trying to rally the others. But his voice was swallowed by the whispers of the clowns, their hollow voices echoing in the pit. "Help us! Join us!" The clowns moved with an unnatural grace, their movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring the fear that radiated from the performers. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to think of a way out. But every direction she looked, there were more clowns, more twisted faces and cold, lifeless eyes. Suddenly one of the performers, a tall man with a painted smile that now seemed like a mockery of his former self, stepped forward, his eyes wide with terror. "This is our fault," he whispered, his voice trembling. "We disturbed them. We woke them up." Before anyone could react, he lunged toward the nearest ghostly clown, his hands outstretched as if to push it away. But the clown moved faster than any of them could have anticipated, its cold fingers wrapping around the man's wrist. There was a sickening crack, and the man screamed as his arm twisted at an impossible angle. The other performers cried out, backing away from the clowns. But there was nowhere to run. The pit was too small, too confined. They were trapped, and the clowns knew it. Emma's mind raced as she searched for anything that might help them. The base of the Ferris wheel was rusted and decayed, but there had to be something, anything, they could use to defend themselves. Her eyes landed on a length of chain lying in the corner, half buried in the dirt. She scrambled toward it, her fingers digging into the cold earth as she pulled the chain free. It was heavy, thick with rust, but it was something. She swung it at the nearest clown, hoping to make contact, to do something, anything, to break the hold these spirits had on them. But the chain passed through the ghostly figure as if it were made of smoke. The clown didn't even flinch, its hollow eyes locking onto hers. It smiled, a wide, grotesque grin that sent shivers down her spine. "Join us," it whispered, its voice filled with an unnatural sweetness. Emma backed away, her heart racing. The chain had been useless. They couldn't fight these spirits with physical force. But then, a thought struck her. If they couldn't fight them, maybe they could reason with them. "Wait!" she called out, her voice shaking. "We don't want to hurt you. We're just trying to bring the park back to life." The clowns paused, their twisted faces turning toward her. For a moment there was silence, and Emma dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, she'd gotten through to them. But then, the clowns began to laugh, a deep, hollow sound that echoed through the pit. The laughter was filled with malice, with the bitterness of lives cut short and dreams shattered. The clowns closed in once more, their voices a cacophony of whispers and jeers. "Join us! Help us!" Emma's hope shattered. There was no reasoning with these spirits. They were too far gone, consumed by their anger and despair. The performers were nothing more than intruders in their domain, and the clowns wanted them to suffer for it. Suddenly, a voice broke through the clamor, a voice that didn't belong to the clowns. It was soft, barely more than a whisper, but it carried with it a sense of urgency. "You must leave this place, before it's too late." Emma whipped around, searching for the source of the voice. It wasn't coming from the clowns. It was coming from above. She looked up and saw a figure standing at the edge of the pit, shrouded in fog. The figure was indistinct, more shadow than substance, but there was something familiar about it. "Who are you?" Emma called out, her voice trembling. The figure didn't respond, but it lifted a hand, pointing to a section of the pit's wall that was partially covered in debris. "There is a way out," the voice said, echoing through the pit. "But you must hurry." The clowns reacted instantly, their faces contorting with rage. They surged forward, their hands outstretched, trying to grab hold of the performers. Emma didn't hesitate. She sprinted toward the section of the wall the figure had indicated, the others close behind her. They reached the wall and began frantically digging through the debris. The clowns were right behind them, their whispers growing louder, more frantic. The performers could feel the cold breath of the spirits on the back of their necks as they dug, their fingers bleeding from the effort. Finally, they uncovered a narrow passageway, just big enough for them to squeeze through. Emma didn't think twice. She pushed her way into the passage, the others following close behind. The walls were tight, pressing in on them from all sides. But they didn't stop. Behind them, the clowns' whispers turned to screams of rage. The passageway shook, as if the spirits were trying to collapse it, to trap them inside. But the performers kept moving, driven by sheer terror. After what felt like an eternity, they emerged on the other side of the passageway, gasping for breath. They were back in the park, the fog still thick around them, but the clowns were nowhere to be seen. Emma collapsed to the ground, her heart pounding in her chest. They had escaped, for now. But the park was still filled with danger, and the spirits were still out there, waiting for their chance to strike. They had to find a way to stop the clowns for good, or they would never make it out of the park alive. The fog clung to the performers like a shroud as they huddled together, trying to catch their breath. The chilling whispers of the clowns had faded, but the memory of their ghostly presence lingered in the cold air. Emma's mind raced as she tried to piece together what had just happened. The mysterious figure that had guided them to safety. Who or what was it? And how had it known about the hidden passage? The more she thought about it, the more questions arose, each more unsettling than the last. Jack sat beside her, his face pale and drawn. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma didn't have an answer. She stared at the thick fog that surrounded them, knowing that it was only a matter of time before the spirits returned. They had narrowly escaped the pit, but they were still trapped in the park with no clear way out. "We need to find Victor," she said finally. "He might know something about the park's history, something that could help us stop the clowns." The others nodded, though the fear in their eyes was unmistakable. They had all heard the stories, but none of them had taken the time to truly understand the park's dark past. Now it seemed that ignorance could cost them their lives. They moved cautiously through the fog, their eyes darting around for any sign of movement. The park, once a place of joy and laughter, was now a twisted labyrinth of shadows and decay. Every creak, every rustle of leaves made them jump, their nerves frayed to the breaking point. As they walked, Emma's thoughts turned to the tragic accident that had claimed the lives of the original clowns. The details were hazy, stories passed down over the years, distorted by time and superstition. But there was one thing she knew for certain. The accident had been no ordinary mishap. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the park's main office, a small, dilapidated building near the entrance. The door was ajar, and the inside was dark and musty, filled with the stench of mold and rot. Emma hesitated before pushing the door open, her hand shaking slightly. "Victor?" she called out, her voice echoing through the empty space. There was no response. The group cautiously entered the office, their footsteps echoing on the warped wooden floor. The room was filled with old papers and photographs, remnants of the park's former glory. Emma's eyes scanned the clutter, searching for anything that might provide a clue. Then, in the corner of the room, she spotted a large, dust-covered book. It was bound in cracked leather, the pages yellowed with age. She picked it up, brushing off the dust, and opened it to the first page. The book was a ledger, a record of the park's operations dating back decades. As Emma flipped through the pages, she found entries detailing the day-to-day activities of the park, from maintenance schedules to ticket sales. But then, near the back of the book, she found something that made her blood run cold. It was a newspaper clipping, carefully folded and tucked between the pages. The headline read, "Tragic Accident Claims. Lives of Clowns. Park shut down indefinitely." Emma's hands trembled as she unfolded the clipping, revealing the article beneath. It detailed the horrific accident that had occurred during one of the park's final performances. According to the report, the clown car had been involved in a collision while performing a stunt, resulting in a fiery explosion that had killed all 12 clowns inside. But as she read further, Emma realized that there was more to the story than she had ever known. The article mentioned rumors of sabotage, claims that the accident had been caused deliberately by someone with a vendetta against the park's owner. Her heart skipped a beat as she reached the final paragraph. It described how, in the days following the accident, strange occurrences had been reported in the park. Unexplained noises, sightings of ghostly figures, and a chilling sense of unease that seemed to hang over the grounds. "The spirits of the clowns are said to linger," the article concluded, "seeking revenge on those who wronged them." Emma's breath caught in her throat. The clowns weren't just restless spirits. They were vengeful, trapped in the park by the circumstances of their deaths, and now they were lashing out at anyone who dared enter their domain. She looked up at the others, her voice trembling. It wasn't an accident. Someone sabotaged the stunt. And the clowns have been haunting this place ever since. Jack's face paled. But why? Why would someone do that? Emma shook her head, her mind racing. I don't know. But if we can find out who was responsible, maybe we can put the spirits to rest. Just then, the door to the office creaked open, and Victor stepped inside, his face grim. He looked at the group, his eyes lingering on the book in Emma's hands. So, you found it, he said quietly. The truth about what happened here. Emma's heart pounded in her chest. You knew, didn't you? You knew the park was haunted, and you brought us here anyway. Victor sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. I didn't want to believe it, but the more I uncovered about this place, the more I realized that something was very, very wrong. I thought that reopening the park would somehow fix things. That the spirits would be at peace if the park was alive again. But it hasn't, Jack said, his voice filled with anger. You've put us all in danger. Victor met his gaze, his expression weary. I know. And now, the only way to stop this is to find out who was responsible for the accident, and make amends if that's even possible. Emma looked back at the ledger, her mind racing. The answer had to be here, somewhere in the park's history. If they could find the person who had caused the accident, perhaps they could finally put the clown's spirits to rest. But as they turned back to the ledger, a cold gust of wind blew through the room, scattering the papers and photographs. The lights flickered, and the unmistakable sound of laughter echoed through the air once more. The clowns were coming for them. The laughter that echoed through the room was cold, devoid of any joy. It sent a chill down Emma's spine, and she knew that their time was running out. The spirits of the clowns had been awakened, and they were closing in, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. Victor grabbed a flashlight from a nearby shelf, his hands shaking. We need to find out who was behind the accident, he said urgently. It's the only way to stop this. Emma nodded, flipping through the ledger with renewed urgency. The old, yellowed pages were filled with details about the park's operations, but nothing that pointed to the identity of the saboteur. Her frustration mounted with each passing second, the oppressive atmosphere of the park bearing down on her. Then, she found it. An entry in the ledger, dated just days before the accident. It was a note from the park's original owner, a man named Harold Grayson, who had written about receiving threatening letters from an anonymous source. The letters had warned him to shut down the park or face dire consequences. Emma's heart raced as she read the final entry. It mentioned a former employee who had been fired shortly before the accident, a man named Lucas Thorne. According to the note, Thorne had been a mechanic who worked on the rides, but he had been dismissed after a series of safety violations. Grayson had suspected Thorne of being behind the threats, but the police had never been able to prove his involvement. This is it, Emma said, showing the entry to Victor and Jack. Lucas Thorne. He's the one who sabotaged the clown car. He's the reason the clowns died. Victor's face darkened. And now their spirits are trapped here, seeking revenge for what was done to them. Jack looked around nervously, the shadows in the room seeming to stretch and twist as the clowns drew nearer. So what do we do? How do we stop them? Emma thought for a moment, her mind racing. If Thorne was the one responsible, maybe we can find something that belonged to him, something that ties him to the park. If we can destroy it, maybe the spirits will be freed. Victor nodded, though his expression was grim. It's a long shot, but it's all we've got. The group hurriedly left the office, the fog outside thicker than ever. The oppressive atmosphere was suffocating, and the whispers of the clowns seemed to follow them as they made their way through the park. As they reached the old maintenance shed where Thorne had once worked, the door creaked open on its own, revealing the dark interior. The shed was filled with rusted tools and broken equipment, the air thick with the smell of oil and decay. Emma's heart pounded as she stepped inside, her flashlight casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. They searched the shed in silence, the only sound the creaking of the old building and their own ragged breathing. Emma rifled through drawers and cabinets, her hands trembling as she sifted through the forgotten remnants of the park's past. Then, in the back of the shed, she found it, a small leather-bound journal hidden beneath a pile of old rags. The cover was worn, the pages brittle with age. Emma opened it, her breath catching in her throat as she read the first page. It was Thorne's journal, filled with his angry rants about the park and its owner. The entries grew increasingly unhinged, detailing his plans to sabotage the rides and exact revenge on Grayson for firing him. The final entry was dated the day of the accident, and it detailed the modifications he had made to the clown car, modifications that had ensured the deadly collision. Emma's hands shook as she handed the journal to Victor. This is it. This is what's tying the spirits to the park. Victor's expression was grim as he took the journal. Then we need to destroy it. Now. Before they could act, the temperature in the shed plummeted, and the laughter of the clowns filled the air once more. The lights flickered, and shadows began to dance on the walls, growing darker and more menacing with each passing second. The clowns had found them. Emma's heart raced as she looked around for anything they could use to destroy the journal. Her eyes landed on a small metal trash can in the corner, and she grabbed it, her hands trembling. We need to burn it, she said urgently, placing the journal inside. Victor fumbled with his lighter, the flame flickering weakly in the cold air. The shadows on the walls began to take shape, forming twisted, nightmarish clowns that loomed over them, their hollow eyes filled with malice. Hurry! Jack shouted, his voice filled with panic. Victor finally managed to light the edge of the journal, and the flames quickly spread, consuming the old, brittle pages. The shadows around them writhed and twisted as the journal burned, the clown's laughter growing louder, more frantic. As the flames consumed the last of the journal, the laughter abruptly stopped. The temperature in the shed began to rise, and the oppressive atmosphere seemed to lift, as if a great weight had been removed from the air. The clowns were gone. For a moment, the group stood in stunned silence, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The shadows had faded, leaving the shed feeling eerily empty. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to process what had just happened. We did it, Jack whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. We actually did it. Victor nodded, though his expression remained somber. The spirits are at peace now. The park, it's finally free. Emma looked around the shed, the weight of the night's events settling over her. The clowns were gone, but the memory of their twisted faces and hollow laughter would haunt her forever. As they left the shed and stepped back into the foggy park, Emma couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The park was quiet now, the oppressive atmosphere gone, but the scars of the past still lingered in the shadows. They had survived the night, but the park would never be the same, and neither would they.